Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Netroots, for providing this space and opportunity to discuss such important issues. I'm honored to be moderating this panel today with some amazing people. We have Nicole Porter, Senior Director of Advocacy at the Sentencing Project, Zach Winston, Policy Director at the Oregon Justice Resource Center, Evelyn Betts-Gaston, Project Manager at Illinois Alliance for Reentry and Justice, and Jen Dean, Deputy Director at Chicago Votes. Now, these folks, great folks, will be able to answer your questions at the end of our discussion, but feel free to write your questions in the chat and throughout the program, and we will get to as many questions as we can. My name is Reggie Thetford. I'm the Deputy Political Director at Stand Up America. And for those that don't know, Stand Up America is a progressive grassroots community of more than 2 million members across the country who are working to protect and expand our freedom to vote in undemocratic barriers that conservatives have built to block the progress that Americans need and build a more representative democracy. One of the ways we are doing this is by advocating for all Americans to have access to the ballot, even if they have a felony conviction. And our community is amazing at driving calls and emails to legislators, submitting letters to the editor, to their local newspaper, and taking other grassroots actions. And this is what our community did this year in New York, Connecticut, and in Oregon. And before we get into that, though, I do want to just touch on the current state of felony disenfranchisement in America today. So as of 2020, these laws disenfranchised roughly 5.2 million Americans with felony convictions. Confusion about these laws effectively disenfranchise even more, sometimes those with misdemeanor convictions who never lost or whose never right to vote in the first place. Now, with regard to racial disparities, in 7 states, Alabama, Florida, Kentucky, Mississippi, Tennessee, Virginia, and Wyoming, more than 1 in 7 Black adults are disenfranchised. And in total, 1.8 million Black citizens are banned from voting. Now, reenfranchisement can be achieved by state law, ballot initiative, and sometimes by executive action from state governors. In the past few years, I just want to highlight a few states. Nicole Porter will go into more depth about the history and kind of the positive trend we've seen over many more years. But as you can see, there has been legislation passed in Colorado, New Jersey, Nevada, as well as Arizona for those who are reentering society and finish their prison sentence. In 2020, California, they passed the ballot initiative. And then in DC, they passed a law where DC residents can vote while actually incarcerated for a felony conviction. And then we saw Governor Kim Reynolds take executive action in Iowa to restore voting rights to those returning with felony convictions. Now, in 2021, this year, legislatures in New York, Connecticut, and Washington restored voting rights to citizens on parole. And we had the great honor at Stand Up America to work with some great partners to help pass that. And so I just want to take a moment to talk about some of the actions that we helped take. So as I mentioned, New York, they passed a law that permanently reenfranchised nearly 43,000 New York citizens, nearly 3/4 of whom are Black and Latino. Now, before this law was passed, their rights were not automatically restored, even though they had completed prison sentences and returned home to their families, work jobs, pay taxes, and contribute to society. Now, the governor routinely signed orders restoring voting rights to people on parole, but there was no guarantee that future governors would continue this practice. And even that practice alone caused confusion among returning citizens, parole officers, and election officials. Now, with the help of our partners, our community sent over 2,000 emails to New York State legislators and submitted over 250 letters to the editor. In addition to that, our digital team educated New Yorkers about this issue by drafting blog posts and other educational content. And we worked with great partners such as Vocal New York, the Brennan Center, and the Alliance of Families for Justice, just to name a few, to raise awareness on this issue. Now, in Connecticut, over 3,200 citizens, 1/3 of whom are Black, were disenfranchised even though they had completed their prison sentence. Now, Connecticut's criminal legal system has some of the worst racial disparities in the nation. Only 10% of Connecticut's population is Black, but yet 41% of its prison and jail population is Black. Latinos are 13% of the population, but 29% of the prison population is Latino. Now, our community worked with groups like Unlock the Vote, Common Cause, Brennan Center, and more to drive over 500 emails to the Connecticut legislature from constituents. And we also helped set up tools for them to use. Now, I want to just touch on this map here provided by the Brennan Center just to highlight how different each state is as far as felony disenfranchisement laws go and how confusing it can be. Just want to highlight Maine and Vermont, states that never disenfranchise folks with felony convictions. And then as you see, some of the sky blue states have passed laws either recently or in the past for folks who have finished their sentence. And then as you can see, red, orange, and yellow, we still have a lot of work to do as far as reenfranchising those with felony convictions. Now, I just want to provide a little hope on where we can possibly see some legislation move, hopefully within the next year or two. Now, in New York and New Jersey, there are groups that are working to introduce and pass legislation that would restore voting rights to those currently in prison, hopefully within the next few years. And then in Oregon, we saw legislation introduced this year that would have allowed all citizens in prison to be able to vote. And Zach will touch more on that later. And then in Illinois, there's legislation, or their legislature is actually slated to pass a bill, and this would make history, that would allow all citizens to vote while in prison. And Jen Dean will touch more on that later. But I do want to just touch on some of the work that we did with the amazing partners in Oregon Justice Resource Center, and Next Step. So we used, Stand Up America, we used SMS, email, and other digital mobilization tactics to drive our community to send over 1,400 emails to legislators. We created a video on the history of felony disenfranchisement in Oregon from its time as a state with sunset laws on the books till now. And I'll share that video on the chat. And then our community shared this on social media, and we also partnered with John Legend to drive even more action. We hope to continue some of this work in Oregon, but again, Zach will cover more on that. And then currently in Illinois, we are working with Chicago Votes, as well as the Illinois Alliance for Justice and Reentry. We are currently running ads, and we will be driving other digital actions to help get this passed in the video session. Now, progressive activists are increasingly aware of the injustice of felony disenfranchisement laws and their long racist history, and they are taking action. Stand Up America members, every time they make a call or send an email or post on social media or write to their local paper, are showing state legislators that their constituents care about this issue. And restoring voting rights to everyone is vital to our democracy. And Stand Up America is going to continue to fight to change these laws across the country. And I'm thrilled to be working with such great partners like the people in this great panel. Now, I would like to pass the mic to Nicole Porter, Director of Advocacy at the Sentencing Project, to give us a brief history of felony disenfranchisement across the nation and discuss some changes that we've seen within the last 20 years or so.
Thanks, Reggie. So good afternoon, everyone. I am Nicole with the Sentencing Project. Sentencing Project is a research and advocacy organization that's been around for over 30 years in DC. And it's a bridge organization between the activists and the academy, helping to popularize research and align that with state campaigns and the work that folks are doing on the ground to challenge mass incarceration and end collateral consequences, including ending felony disenfranchisement. The numbers associated with felony disenfranchisement, the estimates that are a part of the conversation, have been popularized by the Sentencing Project along with our partner Human Rights Watch since the late 90s. And we continue to update that analysis in terms of estimating the number of people impacted state by state by felony disenfranchisement laws. Reggie went over a lot of this, but as you all heard, these laws are in place in most states, 48 states, with the exception of Maine and Vermont, which never ended the franchise for folks in prison. And then Washington, D.C. just last year expanded the franchise. So the number that Reggie went over is 5.2 million people are prohibited from voting because of a felony conviction. That number has changed since the 70s when the era of mass incarceration grew. And I'll get to that in a later slide. But in terms of the history of felony enfranchisement, so in the United States, this policy, this practice has been uniquely racialized, but the history of it does start with the settler community when English colonialists brought the practice to North America through the common law practice of civil death, a set of criminal penalties that included the revocation of voting rights. So early colonial laws limited the penalty of disenfranchisement to certain offenses, including voter fraud offenses at the time and other offenses considered egregious violations of the moral code. After the American Revolution, states began codifying disenfranchisement provisions and expanding the practice to all felony offenses. And in many states, felony disenfranchisement policies really grew following the Civil War. As we were wrapping up the Civil War, and by 1869, 29 states had enacted such laws. Now, in the post-Reconstruction period, when Southern states were reconstituting themselves, they tailored disenfranchisement laws specifically to exclude Black male residents from the franchise, targeting offenses that they were biased to believe more frequently committed by Black residents. So, for example, in Mississippi, and this is part of that state's constitutional history, white elites called for the disenfranchisement of offenses like burglary, theft, arson, but not for robbery or murder. And the author of Alabama's disenfranchisement provision estimated that the crime of wife beating alone would disqualify 60% of the, quote, Negroes, resulting in the policy that would disenfranchise a man for beating his wife, but not for killing her. So in Mississippi today, individuals have to get legislation introduced at the individual level and passed the way any law has to get passed, introduced in one chamber, makes its way to the other chamber, and eventually to the governor's desk, and hoping that the governor doesn't veto it. So since 1997, 410 bills were introduced in the Mississippi legislature on behalf of individual residents. This year, 32 residents sought suffrage through individual legislation filed on their behalf, and only 2 persons got their suffrage bills all the way to the governor's desk. And those bills, those folks got their rights back without the governor signing his signature to the legislation. So I'm going to wrap up my comments with this, that today, oh, Reggie, can you go to the next slide, please? I forgot that we were advancing 3 slides. So Reggie talked about the disenfranchisement amongst and the disproportionate impact of disenfranchisement on Black residents and the Black electorate in particular. And I touched on that with the history of state constitutional conversations following the Civil War and during the post-Reconstruction era. Can you go to the next slide, please? Next slide, please. And then I think the previous one. The Latin, yes. I just wanted to zero in on this because since the mid-70s, the growth in incarceration, the growth in mass incarceration has increased by over 700%. And that has been mirrored in the impact on felony disenfranchisement and the number of residents excluded from the franchise. While the history of this has been racialized, particularly with the goal of intentionally excluding Black residents from the franchise because of bias, this policy has also included other communities in the net of felony disenfranchisement. And we estimate that over 560,000 Latinx residents are disenfranchised. And this is intentional in terms of the impact of felony disenfranchisement growing since the mid-70s and impacting not just the residents who were intended by the policy, but also catching up other people in this racist history along with the policy, and has implications as the United States moves to a majority minority demographic and has implications for a multiracial democracy. So felony disenfranchisement and ending it should be an intentional strategy, a part of that. Can you go to the next slide, please? So I just want to wrap up by saying that part of this history is that there's always been a history of marginalized groups seeking their voting rights. And that is certainly true for formerly incarcerated residents who've been working at perfecting democracy by ending felony disenfranchisement and expanding efforts to restore rights restoration in many states that Reggie highlighted earlier. So this is a continuation, this is a through line of that effort, including the fact that there are incarcerated women who are directly impacted by these felony disenfranchising laws. So when the 19th Amendment passed, not all women got the right to vote, because those in prison and those justice involved and excluded from the franchise because of their felony conviction history were still disenfranchised from voting. So, but in the context of this conversation, there continues to be a great deal of work that we can do and should be doing around guaranteeing that all citizens have the right to vote. And this is one constituency where there's a lot of work to do given the map that Reggie highlighted earlier. So I'll wrap up my comments there and look forward to the comments from others on the panel.
Thanks, Nicole. And so now I would like to pass the mic to Zach Winston, Policy Director at the Oregon Justice Resource Center. So as someone that's formerly incarcerated, could you just tell us a bit about your story and how it's impacted your advocacy on this issue?
Definitely. Thanks, Reggie. So it's great to be here virtually today. So I'm Zach Winston. A quick background on me. I'm currently the Policy Director for the Oregon Justice Resource Center in Portland, Oregon, and formerly incarcerated, as Reggie mentioned. So after my release, I attended law school and practiced criminal defense law for a few years before gaining some direct service experience working with justice-involved families. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience as a formerly incarcerated individual and why universal suffrage, that is allowing people to vote while incarcerated, is so important. And then a little bit about an Oregon bill from last legislative session that Reggie had touched on, which tried to restore voting rights to currently incarcerated individuals. So my incarceration experience can be summed up kind of in two words, boredom and removed. Boredom is generally easy for people to understand, right? Incarceration is boring. Much of my time was spent trying to find ways to pass the time. At points, I was so bored that studying for the law school admissions test often seemed appealing. The boredom only compounded my feelings of being removed. And for me, removed has two meanings, right? There's physically removed from the community, but also in the sense that I was removed or disconnected from the rest of the world. Communicating with individuals on the outside is expensive and erratic and inconsistent, I guess. Putting money on your books for phone calls or traveling long distances for in-person visitation is often burdensome and difficult for family and friends. At some points, it felt like the rest of the world was moving forward while I was stuck in place, unable to move forward. So this feeling of being removed from the community contributes to feeling disconnected from your community and powerless. For many, this can have a significant negative impact on behavior while incarcerated and the ability to successfully re-enter the community upon release. While incarcerated, I found that many of the individuals I was spending time with wanted to feel and be connected to and with their communities. We knew that approximately 95% of us would be returning to the community, and the decisions made while we were incarcerated would often have an impact on us once released. Furthermore, many of us had loved ones, some including children, who remained in the community and were impacted by decisions of the public officials. Additionally, we faced unique challenges, specifically related to incarceration, that often go unaddressed or ignored by public officials. So although this happened after my incarceration, like COVID-19 is a perfect example that illustrates a unique issue that currently incarcerated individuals face that the general public either struggles or refuses to understand. For example, COVID-19 cases were 10 times higher in Oregon prisons than in the state broadly. The inability to vote while incarcerated allows states to, or the state or any states to deprioritize issues facing the incarcerated population. There's really no incentive for them to prioritize them. I found that everyone I met had different levels of exposure to and interaction with voting. That said, it was clear that most, if not all, of us had ideas and opinions on issues impacted by our public officials. In fact, I would say that many of my conversations with other incarcerated individuals on criminal justice issues often surprised me as they veered into support for more conservative viewpoints, which was interesting for me in there. So discovering and maintaining healthy values and habits is vital to successful reentry. While a person in prison may not have voted before, we as a community should celebrate and encourage involvement in civic engagement. Additionally, a Marshall Project survey found that the more time that respondents spent in prison, the more motivated they were to vote, and the more they discuss politics, and the more likely their opinions are to evolve. Voting is power. It's the power to hold electeds accountable. It's the power to express our values and the power to better the lives of our friends and family in the community. Taking that power away only serves to further disenfranchise incarcerated individuals and reinforce the narrative that those of us who've been or currently are incarcerated are less than others. So I just want to transition real quick into my work on this issue at the Oregon Justice Resource Center. Our core projects there, our programs there include the Civil Rights Project, Immigrant Rights Project, Oregon Innocence Project, Women's Justice Project, and Youth Justice Project. So we cover a wide range of issues, and we strive to use our knowledge from direct services to inform and guide our policy work. And so in 2021, in the Oregon legislature, we ran a bill with Next Up Action Fund, seeking to restore rights to incarcerated individuals in prison. And so as Nicole mentioned, and is true across the country, Oregon's decision to disenfranchise this population is steeped in racism. So a quick background on that: in 1844, 15 years before Oregon became a state, the Territorial Legislative Committee enacted Black exclusion laws that prohibited Black people from settling in Oregon. At a constitutional convention in 1857, Oregon's Legislative Assembly approved articles that clearly envisioned the exclusion of all rights for people of color. The convention restricted Black people from military service and voting, granted property rights to only white citizens, and implemented felony disenfranchisement laws. In Oregon, Black, Asian, and Native people were deemed criminals as soon as they stepped on Oregon soil. Therefore, the argument for prisoner disenfranchisement was founded on the belief that it was a necessary policy in order to keep Black, Asian, and Native people from voting, because doing so was in the interest of an all-white society. As one historian has put it, the Oregon Constitution was thoroughly a white man's document, and then Chief Justice Williams urged lawmakers to, quote, consecrate Oregon to the use of the white man and exclude the Negro, Chinaman, and every race of that character. In 1859, Oregon became the only state to be admitted to the Union with an exclusion law in its constitution. Oregon did not repeal Black exclusion laws until 1926. Voters did not opt to officially remove the language from the Constitution until 2002. So the bill only needed a simple majority in both chambers, but unfortunately it was held up in the Budget Committee and didn't pass. Had it passed, the legislation would have allowed people in prison to register to vote using their last voluntary address, while using the correctional facility as the mailing address. If someone did not have a last voluntary address or couldn't remember their last voluntary address, which we've heard occasionally happens, they could use a definable location in the county that describes their last voluntary address, which could be a shelter, park, motorhome, etc., any other identifiable location. And I'll just wrap with one important lesson that we learned from this effort was that the arguments against allowing people in prison to vote resonated with both Democrats and Republicans. We encountered several Oregon Democrats who firmly believed that people in prison should not be allowed to vote as punishment for their conviction. Others simply stated they were happy with the status quo in Oregon, which is automatically registering individuals when released from incarceration, as you saw on the map that Reggie and Nicole shared, and didn't see the point in expanding on this since other states are still catching up to where Oregon is currently at. We plan to introduce the bill this session or next session and hope momentum will continue to build nationwide for this really important reform. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, Zach. Great insight. Again, thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for your advocacy on this such important issue. Now I want to pass the mic to Avalon, project manager at the Illinois Alliance for Justice and Reentry. And for Avalon, I posed the same question. Could you tell us a bit about your story and how it's impacted your advocacy on this issue, especially as an Illinois resident with law slated to pass and make history, hopefully soon?
Thank you so much, Reggie, for inviting me out, and for everybody in attendance. We really appreciate this. This is an extremely important topic. So as Reggie introduced, my name is Avalon Betts-Gaston. I am the project manager for the Illinois Alliance for Reentry and Justice. We are a statewide coalition of directly impacted individuals, stakeholders, service providers, and allies, united to redefine reentry and remake justice. And so I am a directly impacted person. I am a Chicago native. I was born and raised in Chicago. I've lived on every side of town in Chicago. And I went to undergrad in Chicago. I went to law school in Chicago. And in 2015, I was wrongfully convicted. And I served 4 years in federal prison. I have always been civically engaged. I was raised that way. My grandfather was the patriarch of the family. We were that family that you got dressed up when he was around in your Sunday's best and you went to vote. It was no joke in our household, and he would literally tell you who to vote for. I had uncles that were precinct captains. So again, being politically involved was integral to my everyday existence. And so when I was sentenced to prison, I was sent all the way to West Virginia, and my voice was silenced. I kept having these recurring nightmares of screaming and no sound coming out. And that's what it feels like to be incarcerated and to not have your right to vote. You're screaming, you're saying things, you're trying to speak, and there's no sound. It was devastating for me because that part of my life was who I was. And as a mother, I had young children at the time, and I was always very, and still am very involved in their schooling. I no longer had a say on who was on school boards, where could parks be located because I wasn't voting on our local electeds, how much money gets contributed to our schools or to our local municipalities, because again, my voice had been silenced while I was incarcerated. And it was devastating. The incarceration was devastating, but every component of the incarceration was devastating to me. And it was just, you lose hope to a certain extent when you have that connection to your community stripped away from you. By being physically removed from your community, but also by being disconnected from the ballot box. And people in prison need that connection. They need that worth identity to say that, you know, my voice matters to the people that I live with. And that only happens through the franchisement of the voting franchisement. And you know, conditions in prison are very difficult. And I know a lot of people say, don't do the crime if you can't do the time. The time is the separation from your family. That's the punishment. Everything else on top of that is really unnecessary. And so the conditions in prison are horrendous. There is not one women's prison in our country where women are either subject to sexual misconduct at the behest of the staff members, or a victim or witness to that sexual misconduct and sexual harassment or assault. So every day you are witnessing something that is traumatic in a prison. We have a prison here in Illinois where the men don't even have access to drinking water and haven't had access to drinking water for weeks. Now, none of the local electeds are going to care about the fact that these men are being served water out of garbage bags that they are bringing in from somewhere because they don't have access to drinking water. So they can't shower, they can't do any of those things. And because they don't have a voice at the ballot box, none of the local politicians care. They don't care that these men are literally being served water from garbage bags. And so ending felony disenfranchisement will improve the real life conditions of our community members that are currently serving time in our prisons. In Illinois, we only disenfranchise people if they are serving time in a prison. You have a right to vote up until the time that you are imprisoned, and then immediately after you are released. I was released in the midst of a pandemic, and it was very interesting. While I was there, we had staff members that were doing in the middle of a pandemic, was doing community tours. So they were literally bringing in community members to tour them around the facility, including our housing units, showing them the prison in the middle of a pandemic. These individuals did not have masks. They did not have on any protective gear. We did not have masks because they did not give them to us at that particular time. And these types of conditions happen because we had no voice. We had no way to say who could control what our conditions, our real life conditions look like. And so it is vitally important that we abolish felony disenfranchisement, because people live or die in prison based on the ability of them having a say-so on who gets to determine how they live while in prison. And I just want to point out a couple of things. A lot of people say, well, people in prison don't want to vote. And in my own personal experience, there were 2 incidents where the TV room was packed and where they would allow us to stay up past count time. That was sports finals. So if you had a baseball final or a basketball final or football final that went past count time, they would allow us to go back into the TV rooms to watch those events. And the TV rooms would be packed. And the other one was election night for national elections. The TV rooms were packed, and the COs would allow us to return back into the TV room so that we could watch to the end of whenever, with a reasonable amount of time when those elections would be called. But those TV rooms were packed. Everybody was glued to the television to see who was going to be running this country. And it was very important to them. So that is a false narrative that people in prison are not interested in voting. At least that is something that I did not experience while I was away. And I just want to add that, and I'll end with this. In Illinois, we have approximately 100,000 children who no longer have an advocate at the ballot box for them. Those children did not do anything. They did not commit any offense. They're completely innocent. Yet we have decided that punishment should somehow include silencing advocates for these innocent children. And I just feel like that's a terrible thing. That is not going to prevent someone or deter someone from committing a crime. Not one person while I was away said, if I had known I was going to lose my voting rights, I would have thought twice about doing XYZ. No one said that to me. It doesn't deter crime. It doesn't reduce recidivism. All it does is punishes. And if you have punishment that's ineffective in actually bringing about a positive change to people, then why do we have that? That means we're just being mean. And being mean does not make us a safer society. And so I just think that it's important that we end felony disenfranchisement throughout our country. And I'm very hopeful that we get this bill passed in Illinois in our upcoming veto session. So thank you.
Thank you, Avalon. Thanks for that story. It definitely gives a lot of folks something to think about. And I just want to highlight a few things that both of you all touched on. One is, folks in prison. One thing that I learned working in this line of work is that some people will say, I like to advocate for those that can't advocate for themselves or those that can't speak for themselves. And one thing I learned is that it's not that they can't speak for themselves or voiceless. It's society has actually muted this population. It's not that they can't say anything. It's that we as a society or legislatures have decided to mute this population. And so I just want to highlight that. As well as families and communities outside, they don't deserve to be punished either. And if we can't allow the parents to advocate for their kids, then as Avalon, as you mentioned, then they're the ones that are kind of getting the short end of the stick here. And then as well as it doesn't reduce recidivism to take it away, but providing hope for folks in prison by providing that vote is something you all both touched on. And I think that will be much more of a positive impact moving forward. So now I do want to pass the mic to Jen Dean here, Deputy Director at Chicago Votes, who will touch more on this piece of legislation in Illinois. And hopefully Illinois will set the example in actually re-enfranchising folks currently in prison. Jen,
thank you. Thank you so much for having me, everybody. My name is Jen Dean. I'm the Deputy Director of Chicago Votes. We are a nonpartisan organization who engages young people and people who are incarcerated in the political process. My work specifically is to direct the Unlock Civics program, which has our felony disenfranchisement work in it. So going back to 2017, we started to go into Cook County Jail to do voter registration drives every other Sunday. A couple years later, we've registered over 6,000 people in Cook County Jail. And so these are super excited voters. We found in the women's division, around 74% of the division wanted to vote. So it's really exciting to see the excitement of voting inside Cook County Jail. Once we started to do voter registration in jail, everybody was like, well, how do we vote now? And at Cook County Jail, there really was not a process set up in place so that folks could actually go cast their ballots. There was gossip in the jail that there was a process where they would literally line everybody up and then tell folks who to vote for with very little election authority oversight. That's also concerning given the sheriff is on the ballot and his employees are voting for or against him. And so we really needed to have oversight inside of the jail. So we asked, can we set up polling locations in there? The Chicago Board of Elections at the time said absolutely not. You have to pass legislation to make that happen. So with the help of a huge coalition, specifically ACLU of Illinois, Chicago Lawyers Committee of Civil Rights, Women's League, everybody, Michelle Mbecchiani and Quinn Rollins and I sat down and wrote a voting in jail bill. And essentially it turned Cook County Jail into the first official polling location in the country. It also required that everybody on the way out receives a voter registration form and a Know Your Voting Rights guide. So that was really the first step, is to set up the processes and election protection inside jails, because 94% of the jail is pretrial detention, meaning the majority of people have not lost their right to vote if they are inside jail. So fast forward, Representative Ford approached us and said, hey, do you guys want to help me pass this bill? It's a voting in prison bill. Up until about 2020, the assumption was that we had to change the Illinois Constitution to pass voting in prison. There's two sets of laws. You have your state constitution law, and then you also have your state statute or your election code laws. The Illinois state constitution states that a person has to lose their right to vote, but it must be restored before they are released. So it doesn't say that somebody has to lose their right to vote the entire time they're serving their sentence. So within that loophole, we wrote a bill, another one, and it says that a person will temporarily lose their right to vote for a period of 14 days, and then it will be restored to vote. Like you guys have mentioned, Illinois would be the first state to restore the right to vote for people who are incarcerated. Maine and Vermont, they never lost their right to vote. Not a coincidence that 80% of the people detained in Maine's prison system is white. 90% of them are white in Vermont's prison. So when you think back of all the historical racism that is embedded into this work, that is why we never lost it. And so we would be the first. The Illinois State Board of Elections is opposed to this bill. They claim it is unconstitutional. However, they're not in a place where they should actually be saying that. That's up to the courts to decide. So we are currently trying to still persuade them that it is actually is constitutional through the legal analysis that we have done with the Chicago Lawyers Committee. Yeah, so that's where we're at right now. We have 63 yes votes on the House of Representatives side. So we are currently working on the Senate side to get to our 30. And then obviously we need the governor's signature as well. So that is where we are at with voting in prison in Illinois.
Thank you, Jen. And as you mentioned, yes, it is definitely not the Board of Elections. They're not a judicial review board. And it's so wild that they are making determinations that's certainly not theirs. And we have actually system set up for that, which is the Supreme Court and judges to make that determination.
Absolutely. And the Illinois State Board of Elections specifically is made up of mostly white men. So when you think about their decision making in this process, when they should not be saying anything at all other than that they would support it if it's passed. When we look at who is incarcerated in our Illinois prisons, it's mostly Black men. So the embedded institutional racism that is happening to oppress people's right to vote, it's blatant. And so we also need to have a conversation with the governor saying, hey, why do you keep appointing all of these people who look identical to each other? And they're the ones who are in control of our entire state elections. So it really does come down to an administration battle as well.
That's a great point, bringing up the composition of the board. And it just speaks to how unrepresentative our democracy, actually is in looking at kind of the population and who they represent and who they speak for. And so we are at 15 minutes. And so I do want to allow time for the audience to ask questions. And we actually do have, if we can bring everyone back on stage, that will be great. And we awesome. Okay. And we actually do have one question that I want to raise here, and I'll just read it out just in case for folks that missed it in the chat. So the question is, I know that disenfranchisement is a tool to silence BIPOC voters, but what about genuinely terrible people, child abusers, rapists, etc.? I don't think they deserve to vote. Is the answer to change the way of deciding who gets disenfranchised so it is less racially biased? And is it okay for me to ask this question as a white and privileged person? Who wants to take that one?
So I'll start. So I want to start by asking the question, why is it that only convicted terrible people shouldn't vote versus just terrible people? Because if the statement that you're making is that terrible people should not have the right to vote, whether or not they're convicted of a terrible offense should not dictate that ability, based on the logic that you put forth in your question. And to go back and say, do you have the right to ask that question as a white privileged person? Yes, you do, because we need to have everybody's perspective in this discussion. But I think I challenge you to ask yourself, well, why do I feel that only convicted terrible people shouldn't vote? And you specifically pointed out child abusers, rapists. And I'd like to not add to what your category, because obviously I'm for the abolition of felony disenfranchisement, but just to point out a fact that we all know, our founding fathers were child abusers and rapists, yet they still had the right to vote because none of them were convicted of those offenses. And so if we're going to just disenfranchise bad and terrible people, we shouldn't limit it to just those that have been convicted of terrible offenses, based on the logic that you employ. And because we don't have a system in place to do that in a way that is racially neutral, that isn't built on the racism that our country is inextricably intertwined with, there's no way to continue it in a way that makes it make sense. And I get that in a world that we would all love to live in, whereas the racism that we see every day doesn't exist. Unfortunately, we can't disassociate ourselves from that, and our systems can't seem to disassociate themselves from that embedded racism in our country. And therefore, everything that comes out of that is going to be birthed from that seed. And so we're not at the place where we can guarantee those neutral outcomes. And I just would ask you to ask yourself two questions. Why do I feel that terrible people shouldn't vote? Why do I feel that way? What's behind that? And the second one is, to what end? What does society gain by me believing, or us taking away the right to vote for people we consider terrible? Are we safer? Is my community safer? Are my children safer? What happened? What's the good that happens as a result of that? So I would just challenge you to ask yourself those two questions. Thank you.
I just wanted to add something to that, Avalon. First of all, that's a very insightful take, and I just learned something, and I appreciate the lesson. What I wanted to add, though, was that we're talking about felony disenfranchisement for people with criminal convictions. I think we lose sight of the fact that the criminal sentence is the punishment. But in the United States, we have such a punitive criminal legal apparatus that not only do we disappear people from liberty while they're in prison or jail, we also have these collateral consequences that can attach to people long after they've completed their sentence. There is lifetime disenfranchisement in states like Kentucky, Virginia, and Iowa. So the punishment is the sentence, and to expand sentencing to include these collateral consequences like voting bans reinforces a level of punitiveness that really surfaces the contradictions in U.S. democracy. So as progressive advocates, I need to continue to familiarize myself with the purpose of Netroots, but really the reality of the progressive community in the United States in terms of shaping progressive norms should certainly be centering the ending and the abolition of felony disenfranchisement, because the United States is way a field of Western democracies that don't disenfranchise people who are in prison.
Two very, very excellent points, and I really. Oh, Zach, go ahead. If you have a.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. Nicole and Avalon, I think, answered as best we can. I think the only thing I would add is, one of our hearings on the bill in Oregon, we recorded two adults in custody, current adults in custody, for the testimony, because the Department of Corrections wouldn't let them testify live. So we recorded their statements, and I think I think that we get hung up on what someone's convicted of, and not who the person is. And I think when you listen to some of these individuals who are incarcerated expressing their want and need to vote, it becomes hard to tell who's terrible when you contrast what I heard from those AICs with what I heard on, let's say, January 6th. And so I think that terrible is in the eye of the beholder. I think that if we all were to listen to AICs, those who are incarcerated more, I think we find that it's a lot easier to distance the crime of their conviction from who they actually are as a person. And I personally would be honored to vote alongside anyone who is incarcerated, no matter what their crime of conviction is. So I would just add that part as well.
All three very, very excellent points. And since everyone responded, Jen, do you have anything to add? I don't want to leave you out here.
I think it was handled great. Good job, guys.
Okay. So we don't actually have another question I see in the chat, but one thing I do want to kind of discuss and bring to the table here for discussion is that many folks think that this is I would say, kind of an issue that's primarily blocked by Republicans, right? But we have Illinois, overwhelmingly Democratic, And then also just from the insight I had working with Zach in Oregon, it wasn't just Democrats, or excuse me, Republicans holding up the bill. And so I do want to just ask, you know, kind of what work needs to be done to get piece of legislation like this passed, because it's not necessarily just Republicans holding it up.
That was for me, right?
Yeah, Zach and Jen primarily.
Zach, do you want to go first? Okay, cool. So for us, you know, the biggest part of our Unlock Civics program is to make sure that the people who are most impacted are leading the work and are having the direct conversations with lawmakers. So when it comes to committee hearings, we make sure that our young people like Musa and Bryant Harvey are the ones who are testifying for us, and they're the ones who are writing the testimony. It's not me and then having them read it. And making sure also that they're telling their story in an appropriate way to lawmakers. You know, me going into each room, I can't do it half the justice than our organizers do. So they are the ones who are coming to Springfield with us. It is 3 hours away, but having these face-to-face conversations with lawmakers are so important, and calling their phones. We live in this world where we think that people are calling lawmakers all the time and advocating. That's just not the case. When I'm lobbying in Springfield, for the most part, those phones are dead. They are not ringing. So if you can even get 5 people to call in one day on behalf of voting in prison, that's going to have people talking in the halls in Springfield. So it's not just talking about it and tweeting. People have to be making physical phone calls and going in person. It's super easy to meet with your lawmaker. You call their office, especially if you start out with saying, hi, I'm one of your constituents. I'm a voter. We need to talk about this issue that I care about. You will get a meeting. And if you don't, there's organizations locally that can help you. So call and talk to them.
Yes, great point. Centering those that are impacted most is definitely a great strategy, and I think that a lot of people should follow suit on that. Zach?
Yeah, I would just add, you know, Reggie, we did a lot of discussing of this, and Nicole too, where some of our most difficult conversations, you know, happened with Democrats. I would say they're probably more moderate on the spectrum, but I do think that there is kind of this assumption that I think I even took into the campaign at the start of when we were starting to run the bill, where, you know, oh, we have the Democrat votes, but, you know, we just need to get a few Republicans on board, or even in Oregon, we have the simple majority in both chambers. And so, you know, this shouldn't be a problem at all. You know, that's kind of simplifying it a little bit, but I do think that Nicole's point about the American ethos, the American desire to punish, to this false sense of retribution where we are John Wick style, making sure that others are being punished and that we are dispensing some type of justice, is deeply ingrained. And you know, it's somewhat of a superiority complex that I think a lot of Americans have. I think other countries still struggle with this, but it's uniquely identifiable in the U.S. I think that plays a lot into this, and I don't think it cares about what aisle what side of the aisle you're on, Republican or Democrat. A lot of individuals hold this kind of mentality, and you know, I think Avalon's question of like looking into yourself and why does this make you feel uncomfortable? You know, why does the beacon of democracy, why are citizens of that country having trouble allowing people to vote? And so, yes, I think that I think that anyone who's considering running a campaign or, you know, discussing it, don't overlook, especially the moderate Democrats, but even more progressive Democrats. I think it's an issue that maybe they haven't wrestled with yet. And so it's something that where education is absolutely important. And I 100% agree with Jen that the storytelling from adults in custody, those who are currently serving time, is hugely impactful. You just get by the Department of Corrections not wanting them to testify. So.
Yeah, I just want to just build up. I'm sorry, Reggie.
No.
I just want to add to what Zach was saying, narrative change, that is imperative to the work that we do, because we all come, and I can say I had the same bias in my own myself. I had an opinion of people in prison that was sewn into me by CIS and by all of these TV shows and by society and by the system. As a lawyer, as a person who has a law degree and went to law school, even my academics reinforced this image that I had of people who were impacted by the criminal legal system. And so I needed to unlearn that knee-jerk reaction of retribution and vengeance and that type of thing, because that's just what we're taught from a very early age, and especially for those people. So I just feel like we have to really focus on narrative change. Those individuals like myself and like Zach and others, and King Musa and just amazing people throughout this country, we just need to tell our stories. We need to humanize the face of people who have been impacted by the criminal legal system, so that you can see that it's people who look like your neighbor, who might actually be your neighbor, and that we love our children. We do everything the same way you do. We put our pants on one leg at a time. Everything that you do, we do the same. And that just because we have a conviction, whether a wrongful conviction or a conviction that they consider justified, it matters not, because it doesn't define who we are. No one should be defined by their worst moments. Nobody. And so I think we do have to focus on narrative change.
Absolutely, absolutely. Humanizing those that have been impacted is extremely important, and I think it's something that folks forget about. We have one. I do have one more question, and I think it's a very important question, especially as we talk about passing these pieces of legislation, and it's about what type of infrastructure do we need to develop once these rights are restored? So we can pass these laws, but what do we need to develop to ensure that these rights are maintained moving forward?
I'll start, and I'm going to click since we just have a few minutes left. But I do think the burden should be on the state to notify resident citizens of their right to vote. So to the extent that we can mandate and fund the mandate, but mandate states to notify regularly citizens of their voting rights, particularly since these laws have changed so much since '97. What I didn't mention earlier was that we track these laws. And so since '97, 25 states have expanded the franchise. So, and it's an evolving process. So the state should definitely be required to properly notify citizens of their voting rights.
I would just like to add that Black voters matter. Like, shout out to them for what they did in the 2020 election. Like, they went door to door and was talking to people. That's what we need to do for the people who've been reenfranchised, is go door to door and talk to them, explain to them the importance of the vote. We vote for our judges, we vote for our prosecutors, and we vote for our sheriffs. I mean, not every state vote for judges. Everybody votes for prosecutors and sheriffs, but not everybody votes for judges. We vote for our judges. That is power. If we have 55% Black population in our prisons, that's a result of the judges and the prosecutors. We need to vote them out. And we need to make sure that we exercise that right and tell our neighbors, like, you know, that 55% of the people downstate look like us. And that's because you're ignoring the judicial part of the ballot. Like, we just need to have those conversations with our own people. And I think to emulate the infrastructure that was put in place by Black Voters Matter and other organizations like that is what we need to do. And it needs to be centered on those who have been directly impacted.
I think that's a great point on, before we close, that's a great point on judges. I actually had, when I was in law school, I had a client that I was working with that was currently incarcerated for selling crack cocaine. And he told me the judge that sentenced him was actually one of his clients. So that is, yeah, I know, wild, right? So again, who's a terrible person? Who decides, right? So we are over our hour here. And so I do just want to thank Zach, Nicole, Avalon, Jen. Thank you for all the work that you do. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for everyone that attended this panel. And again, thank you, Netroots, for providing this space and opportunity. Jen, I hope we can get this piece of legislation passed, and Avalon and Zach, I hope Oregon is next.
Thank you, Reggie, for all of your hard work too.
Thanks, Reggie.
Thank you.